There was something cold about the way his shoes clicked across the polished tile. Like a metronome. Steady, purposeful, slightly too loud. He didn't speak to the receptionist, didn't smile at the security guard. Just walked in with his briefcase like he already owned the place. Technically, he did. Christopher Rains, the new CEO, 30-something. Young enough to still carry that gleam in his eyes that said the world was his to restructure. His appointment had been announced just a week ago in one of those sugar-coated memos about leadership transition. I had seen enough transitions in my 17 years to know what that actually meant. Someone upstairs wanted heads to roll, and usually it wasn't theirs. I watched from the glass wall of my small corner office. Not quite executive level, but far enough from the buzz of interns and marketing assistants that I could think clearly. Christopher didn't knock on doors. He opened them, interrupted meetings, walked through the floors with a tablet in hand, scribbling notes, asking questions that didn't wait for full answers. He smiled when people stumbled. Not cruelly, but the way a man smiles when he's already decided something. He didn't come to see me that day. I suppose I wasn't on his radar yet. That was fine. I preferred it that way. At lunch, a few of us gathered in the break room, a group of older employees who didn't try to compete with the energy of the 20-somethings. Someone joked that the new CEO reminded her of a substitute teacher who thought he could fix the whole school in a week. We all laughed, quietly, carefully. I stirred my tea and kept my thoughts to myself. I had outlasted 3 CEOs. One left for health reasons, another for legal ones, and the last because he tried to outsource more than he understood. It didn't matter how sharp their suits were. They always made the same mistake, assuming experience came with a title. When I passed Christopher in the hallway later, he glanced at my ID badge, then looked straight through me. He didn't recognize the name, didn't stop to ask what I did, didn't care that I was carrying the quarterly performance briefs he'd likely be quoting from in his Friday presentation. To him, I was just another face in the system, part of the machinery, not worth inspecting. And yet, as I returned to my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, like the air before a storm. Nothing had happened yet, not really, but you could feel it coming. The way people stopped chatting at their desks, the way certain managers avoided eye contact, the way the HR director looked unusually pale this week. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk. There's a unique kind of stillness that fills a place when it's on the verge of upheaval. And I knew it well. The next week passed like water seeping under a closed door, slowly, steadily, inevitably. Nothing catastrophic happened at first. No official memos, no layoffs. Just a series of restructuring meetings held behind closed doors and whispered conversations in hallways that stopped the moment anyone in a suit walked by. I kept my head down, as I always had, completed reports, coordinated the next video call with Gold Peak Tech in Shenzhen, wrote polite emails in Mandarin to smooth over some minor accounting delays. I didn't see Christopher much, but I heard about him everywhere. He moved through departments like a cold front, bringing nervous laughter and thinly veiled resentment. It wasn't long before the first changes started. He began firing mid-level managers, people who had been with the company for over a decade, sometimes 2. They were called into short meetings and didn't return. No goodbye emails, no handshakes, just empty desks and hastily collected boxes. Their replacements arrived just as quickly. Friends of Christopher mostly. People with shiny resumes, glossy LinkedIn profiles, and little understanding of how our actual business operated. They asked basic questions in meetings. They needed things explained twice. They made jokes about how old school some of our processes were. They called it modernization. I called it a disaster in slow motion. I sat quietly through these transitions, watching, listening. I knew better than to speak up. I knew how fragile stability could be under men like Christopher. How they mistook the silence of seasoned employees for agreement rather than survival instinct. It was during a team meeting on Thursday morning that I first felt the real danger. Christopher was there, of course, standing at the front of the conference room like a general reviewing troops he neither trusted nor valued. He clicked through slides faster than anyone could read them, throwing out words like efficiency, cost centers, and agility. We need to be leaner, he said, flashing that practiced grin. We need to focus on strategic partnerships and eliminate waste. Every department will be evaluated. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't need to. I glanced around the table. Some colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead, faces blank. When the meeting ended, people filed out quietly. I gathered my papers slowly, careful not to be the first or last to leave. As I rose from my seat, I felt a presence beside me. Christopher. Margaret Wright, he said, like he was trying to place a vague memory. Yes, I said. He smiled, that same shallow smile he gave to everyone. What exactly do you handle again? I paused. I could have listed my job title. I could have rattled off my official responsibilities. But I knew none of that would mean anything to him. I manage our communications with Gold Peak Tech and other strategic partners in China, I said carefully. His brow furrowed slightly. We have someone doing translations, don't we? I don't just translate, I said. My voice was calm, even. I manage the relationship, business etiquette, cultural expectations, negotiations. It's a bit more involved. He nodded, distracted, already half-turned toward the door. Well, good. We'll be streamlining a lot of processes soon. Appreciate the work you're doing. And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a moment, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling a deep, cold certainty settle into my bones. He didn't understand. Worse, he didn't want to understand. Outside the conference room, the office buzzed with a forced energy. People typing too loudly, phones ringing, meetings called on short notice. The HR director, a woman named Linda who had been with the company almost as long as I had, looked at me as I passed her desk. She gave me a small, sad smile, one that said, "Be careful." Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and started composing an email to Mr. Liang at Gold Peak. A routine update, a normal communication. But as I typed, I wondered how much longer I would be allowed to do even that. Friday arrived heavy with the scent of rain and something else. Dread. The office was quieter than usual. People spoke in hushed tones. Eyes flickered toward closed doors. The rumor was that another round of realignments was happening before the weekend. At 10:15 a.m., my email pinged. Meeting request, Christopher Rains, 10:30 a.m. conference room B. No agenda, no explanation. Just like all the others who had disappeared this month. I sat very still for a moment, hands folded neatly in my lap. Then I rose, adjusted my jacket, and made my way to the conference room. I moved carefully, deliberately, as if I could somehow control the outcome with the steadiness of my steps. When I entered, Christopher was already seated at the head of the table, a folder in front of him. Linda from HR sat 2 chairs down, her face carefully neutral. She avoided meeting my eyes. Christopher gestured to the chair across from him. "Margaret, good to see you," he said with the briskness of someone getting through a checklist. "Please, have a seat." I sat, my hands folded calmly on the table. He opened the folder, glanced at something, and began. "We've been reviewing our internal structure over the past few weeks, and after careful consideration, we've decided to consolidate certain functions." His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Your role, while valuable in the past, is no longer aligned with the direction we're moving in. We believe that the external firm we've partnered with for language services can cover the needs we have moving forward. There's simply no longer a requirement for a dedicated liaison." I listened without interruption. No flicker of emotion crossed my face. I was well past shock, well past bargaining. This was the inevitable outcome of willful ignorance. Christopher smiled a little, as if trying to soften the blow. "Of course we appreciate your years of service. HR has prepared a severance package for you, 2 months' pay, plus any accrued vacation. It's very fair." Linda slid a beige envelope across the table toward me. Still, I said nothing. Christopher leaned back, mistaking my silence for hesitance. "I know this may be difficult, but change is necessary for growth." I smiled, just slightly. Not bitter, not angry, just sad for him, really. "You're certain you can manage without me?" I asked quietly. He gave a small laugh, almost condescending. We'll be just fine. We need to be more dynamic, more streamlined. It's nothing personal. I stood up, leaving the envelope untouched on the table. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a leader, but a boy playing dress-up with grown-up toys he didn't understand. I wish you good luck on Monday, I said simply. Christopher blinked, puzzled for a second by the strange specificity of my words, but then he smiled again, shallow and confident. Thank you, Margaret. Best of luck to you as well. I walked out of the conference room without looking back, past Linda's pitying glance, past the curious stares of my coworkers, down the long hallway that had once felt like home, now just another corridor in a place I no longer belonged. Outside, the clouds had thickened, low and heavy, pressing down on the city skyline. The first drops of rain tapped against the windows as I reached the lobby. I didn't stop. I didn't cry. I didn't even let my hands shake. By the time I reached my car, the rain had begun in earnest, blurring the world beyond the windshield into a smudged watercolor. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling a strange mix of grief and grim satisfaction. They thought they could replace me, that a contract with a faceless firm could substitute for 17 years of understanding, of trust, of nuance. They thought they were prepared. They weren't. And Monday would prove it. The weekend after my dismissal was strangely peaceful. I cleaned out my home office, answered a few sympathetic texts from former colleagues, the braver ones. Others stayed silent, afraid that any association with me would paint a target on their own backs. I didn't blame them. On Sunday night, I updated my resume. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was simply practical. I had built something over 17 years, something more valuable than a title or a desk. Relationships, reputation, trust. Those things didn't vanish just because Christopher Rains thought he could erase me with a signature. Monday morning, while the city buzzed to life under gray skies, I put on a crisp navy blouse and simple slacks, tucked a portfolio under my arm, and walked into an interview at Lawson & Reed Global Consultants. A former colleague from an industry conference had reached out the day after hearing whispers about my situation. They needed someone who could navigate East Asian business relations, someone who didn't just speak the language but understood the culture beneath the contracts. The meeting was formal but warm. Mr. Reed himself shook my hand, asked pointed but respectful questions, and listened when I answered. It had been a long time since I felt genuinely heard in a room full of executives. By the time I returned home that afternoon, I had an offer sitting in my inbox, better salary, more autonomy, a genuine opportunity to build something instead of holding together the crumbling pieces of someone else's ego trip. I accepted without hesitation. Meanwhile, Ridgemont and Wallace buzzed with nervous energy I could feel even from a distance. My phone lit up sporadically with updates from the few friends who hadn't fallen silent. "He's calling you a social climber now," one message read. "Said you were just trying to hold on to relevance, that the company's better off without old gatekeepers." Another message. "They replaced you with an agency from Singapore. No dedicated liaison anymore. Just rotating account managers. He says it's more efficient." I stared at the texts without emotion. I knew Christopher's type. When men like him failed, they never blamed themselves. They blamed the people they'd pushed out, rewrote the narrative to fit their pride. "Social climber," I murmured aloud, almost amused. If only he knew. If only he understood that I'd never wanted titles or credit. Just competence. Just respect for the work that built the foundation he was now casually tearing apart. But Christopher didn't understand the language of patience, or loyalty, or consequence. Not yet. Monday evening, as the city lights flickered against the wet streets, I poured myself a cup of tea and opened my laptop. I checked the time difference between New York and Shenzhen. I reviewed a few articles about corporate customs in China. Small details, but important ones. The kind of things Christopher's bright young hires probably dismissed as outdated formalities. And I waited, because storms don't announce themselves with fanfare. They build slow and steady until the ground is soaked and the rivers overflow. Tomorrow, the real consequences would begin. And I would not lift a finger to stop it. Monday morning began with the usual corporate theater. Coffee cups, stiff suits, the buzz of artificial enthusiasm. Inside Ridgemont and Wallace, a small group of executives gathered around the 15th floor conference room, waiting for what they believed would be a routine meeting. Gold Peak Tech's delegation from Shenzhen was due to arrive in just under an hour. The deal on the table was massive, a 3-year partnership renewal worth millions. It was one of Ridgemont's cornerstone agreements, a contract that stabilized not just their quarterly targets, but their very reputation in international markets. Christopher Rains sat at the head of the gleaming conference table, tapping his pen against his leather notebook, throwing occasional glances at the clock. To his left sat Martin and Carla, 2 of his hand-picked hires, bright, ambitious, utterly inexperienced in international diplomacy. Across the city, I sat in the spacious, sunlit office of my new company, quietly sipping coffee as I opened my laptop. I didn't have to check the time. I knew exactly what was about to happen. At 10 a.m. sharp, Gold Peak's representatives arrived. Mr. Liang, their vice president of international affairs, accompanied by 2 senior advisors. They entered the room with the quiet grace that masked sharp instincts, a kind of presence Christopher didn't recognize, let alone respect. Christopher stood and extended his hand broadly, a salesman's grin plastered across his face. "Welcome, welcome. So glad you could make it." The Gold Peak delegation exchanged stiff handshakes. No bows, no small talk. The atmosphere was formal, even cold. Christopher, oblivious, launched straight into his presentation, full of buzzwords, efficiency metrics, and cost-saving plans. He spoke quickly, confidently, throwing out slides one after another without waiting for reaction or translation. Mr. Liang listened for a few moments, his expression unreadable. Then he raised his hand, stopping the flow of words mid-sentence. "We would like to speak with Miss Margaret Lane," he said politely but firmly. The room fell silent. Christopher's smile faltered. A shadow crossed his features. "Ah," he stammered slightly. "Margaret is no longer with the company. We've streamlined our communications to a new, highly efficient structure." Mr. Liang exchanged a brief glance with his advisors. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Mr. Liang said, his voice cool and measured, "Miss Lane was not simply a translator. She was our strategic partner. She understood our needs, our culture, our expectations. Without her, I am afraid we must reconsider the future of our cooperation." Christopher chuckled awkwardly. "I assure you, sir, our new processes are even better suited to meet your—" Mr. Liang cut him off with a slight, almost imperceptible wave of his hand. "You have made a grave mistake," he said bluntly. "Firing Miss Lane demonstrates profound disrespect, both toward her and toward our relationship." Christopher's face reddened. I understand your concerns, but I believe in modernization, and—" Mr. Liang rose from his chair, followed immediately by his colleagues. "There will be no renewal of our agreement at this time," Mr. Liang said, his voice final. "We value respect above all else. You have shown us none." Without another word, the delegation left the room, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Christopher remained seated, staring blankly at the door as if willing them to return. Martin fumbled with the laptop. Carla murmured something about following up later. But everyone in that room, including Christopher, knew there would be no follow-up. Within an hour, word spread through the building like wildfire. A $24 million deal, gone. By lunchtime, the CFO had already called an emergency board meeting. Investors were asking questions. Department heads scrambled to contain the fallout. Christopher tried to spin the story. He blamed unexpected cultural complications, accused the Gold Peak team of being rigid and traditionalist. He even hinted that the outsourced firm in Singapore had miscommunicated something. But the truth seeped through. He called Margaret incompetent, someone whispered. He thought a contractor could replace a relationship 17 years in the making. He's finished. Meanwhile, across the city, I finished a client call, logged my notes, and stretched my arms above my head with a quiet smile. I hadn't lifted a finger. They had done it all themselves. And the storm had only just begun. The next few days at Ridgemont and Wallace were a slow-motion collapse. The canceled Gold Peak contract set off a chain reaction. One by one, other international partners started expressing concerns about their agreements. Meetings were postponed, negotiations stalled. A few smaller contracts were quietly terminated. Christopher's authority, once so smug and absolute, began to erode. His shiny new hires floundered, unable to manage the delicate network of relationships Margaret had spent nearly 2 decades building. Inside the company, morale plummeted. Departments that had once prided themselves on stability now operated in fear and confusion. Rumors swirled about upcoming budget cuts. Middle management whispered about board meetings being called behind closed doors. It was almost too easy to watch. On Thursday morning, just 4 days after the disastrous meeting with Gold Peak, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. 30 minutes later, another call, this time from an old office extension I recognized. Curious, I finally picked up. "Margaret, Christopher here," came the voice, artificially bright. "Hope you're well." I leaned back in my chair, smiling slightly. "I'm very well, thank you." "I was hoping we could talk," he continued, rushing through the awkwardness. "You know, clear the air. Maybe discuss some opportunities to collaborate again." "Collaborate," I repeated dryly. Yes. Obviously there were misunderstandings, transitional hiccups. "I think we could find a way to reintegrate your expertise, maybe on a consulting basis. No formal title necessary, just assisting where needed." In other words, he wanted the benefit of my work without restoring my dignity. He didn't want to admit he had made a mistake. He wanted a patch for the hole he had torn, nothing more. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "Of course I'd compensate your time," he added hurriedly, mistaking my quiet for hesitation. I considered my answer carefully. I could have said no outright. I could have hung up, left him to drown in his own arrogance. But something inside me stirred, not bitterness, not rage, something colder, sharper, an opportunity. "Let's meet," I said finally. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. my office." Christopher sounded almost relieved. "Great, fantastic, see you then." I ended the call without another word. That evening, as the city darkened into a blur of lights and soft rain, I sat at my kitchen table and thought carefully about my next move. Christopher wanted help without humility. He wanted salvation without confession, and he would regret asking. The next morning, I prepared carefully. Simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, no visible emotion. Christopher arrived 10 minutes late, just long enough to appear busy, still pretending he held all the cards. He wore the same expensive watch, but the confidence behind his smile was cracked and brittle now. "Margaret," he said, striding into the glass-walled conference room. "Good to see you again." I shook his hand coolly and gestured for him to sit. He launched immediately into his pitch, trying to frame it as a mutual opportunity. There were challenges, he admitted. A few temporary misunderstandings with partners. He avoided saying the word failure. His pride wouldn't allow it. I listened without interruption, my expression neutral. At the end, he spread his hands and said, "We just need someone familiar with these clients to step in and smooth things over. No need to get tangled in titles or structures, just practical support." I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke. "You're offering me a consulting role," I said slowly. "No authority, no public acknowledgement, no correction of the lies you spread after I left." Christopher flushed slightly. "It's not personal, Margaret. It's business." I smiled then, a small, razor-thin smile. So is my answer. He blinked, uncertain. "I'll consider your offer," I said smoothly. "But on my terms?" "What terms?" he asked warily. "You'll see," I said, rising to end the meeting. Because now, I had everything I needed. I wasn't going back to save him. I was going back to show him, and everyone watching, just how much damage a woman they underestimated could do. And this time, they would know exactly whose hand held the blade. The first rule of revenge, if done properly, is patience. Not rage, not noise, patience. I spent the weekend after the meeting planning carefully. I wasn't going to storm into Ridgemont and Wallace demanding retribution. That would have made me small, reactive, exactly what Christopher already thought I was. No. My method would be slower, sharper, surgical. On Monday, under the terms of a short-term consultancy contract Christopher hurriedly signed without reading properly, I re-entered the building. No public announcement, no title. Just a quiet agreement and access to certain internal systems. He thought he was using me. He thought wrong. The office atmosphere had changed since I last walked its hallways. Gone was the casual friendliness, the easy rhythm of people who trusted the ground under their feet. Now there was only brittle silence, broken by hurried conversations and fake laughter. Christopher greeted me in the main lobby with the forced cheer of a man trying to pretend he hadn't lit his own house on fire. "Margaret, welcome back," he said, louder than necessary, drawing a few curious stares from nearby employees. I smiled politely, said nothing, and followed him to the temporary workspace they had arranged, a sterile glass box between two departments. A clear sign that I was here, but not truly welcomed. Perfect. By noon, I had access to the client database. By mid-afternoon, I had quietly contacted Mr. Liang. Not through corporate emails. I wasn't foolish. I called him directly, on a private number he had once given me years ago, back when mutual trust had been something sacred between business partners. He answered after the second ring. "Miss Lane," he said warmly, though there was a note of wary curiosity in his voice. "To what do I owe this honor?" I spoke in Mandarin, slow and respectful, as was proper for the relationship we had built. "I owe you an apology," I said, "for my sudden departure and the confusion that followed." Mr. Liang was silent for a moment, processing the weight of those words. "I understand," he said finally. "Circumstances are sometimes beyond control." "Sometimes," I agreed softly. "And sometimes they are the result of poor judgment." A long pause. Then, "Are you contacting me on behalf of Ridgemont and Wallace?" "No," I said carefully. "I'm contacting you personally, because I believe you deserve to know the truth." I explained, without embellishment or emotion, how I had been forced out, how my warnings had been ignored, how the new leadership viewed our partnership not as a relationship, but as a cost center to be trimmed. Mr. Liang listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked simply, "Where are you now?" "Lawson and Reed Global Consultants," I answered. "We specialize in international partnerships, respectfully, transparently." There was another long pause, then a low chuckle, not cruel but knowing. "I see," he said. "Perhaps it is time we consider new partners." "I leave that decision to your wisdom," I said respectfully, "but I would be honored to work with you again." We ended the call with formal goodbyes, every word carefully measured. And just like that, the first stone had been removed from under Christopher's crumbling foundation. By the end of the week, I arranged a formal introduction between Mr. Liang and the executive team at Lawson and Reed. No fanfare, no announcements, just a quiet meeting in a quiet room. Christopher, meanwhile, continued to stumble through damage control at Ridgemont and Wallace, unaware that the future he was fighting to salvage was slipping, inch by inch, into my hands. I wasn't acting out of hatred. I wasn't even acting out of anger anymore. This was justice, delivered quietly, precisely, and soon it would be complete. It didn't happen all at once. Companies rarely collapse in explosions. They rot from the inside, slowly at first, then all at once. The week after Gold Peak Tech severed ties with Ridgemont and Wallace, the dominoes began to fall. Small accounts closed quietly. Vendors demanded shorter payment terms. A major European client, hearing rumors of instability, froze all pending contracts. Inside Ridgemont's offices, the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was panicked. Employees walked faster, spoke less. Managers who had once bragged about streamlining processes now held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Layoffs began again, this time without the polite fiction of restructuring. Severance packages shrank, resignation letters grew. And still Christopher clung stubbornly to the idea that he could fix it. He called frantic meetings. He gave long, rambling speeches about innovation and resilience. He blamed the market, the economy, even cultural differences, never himself. Meanwhile, I worked methodically. I reached out to 2 other former partners, not directly, of course, through whispers, suggestions, casual conversations. I simply made it known that at Lawson & Reed, we understood the value of respect, of continuity, of true partnership. They didn't need much convincing. By the second Friday, another 2 major accounts had slipped quietly out of Ridgemont's portfolio. Christopher's assistants began sending panicked messages asking me for advice on how to rebuild confidence. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Late that afternoon, I received an official email from the CFO's office. Ridgemont was initiating a temporary suspension of all new business initiatives. Translation: they were hemorrhaging cash. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath, and decided it was time. Time to end this properly. On Monday morning, I asked Christopher for a meeting. He agreed immediately, desperate for anything that looked like a solution. We met in the same sterile conference room where he had first offered me my consultant role. He looked worse now, the expensive watch still on his wrist, but his face drawn, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Margaret," he said, forcing a grin, "I'm glad you wanted to meet. We really need your insight now more than ever. Maybe we can turn this corner together." I cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm not here to advise you," I said calmly. He blinked, confused. "I'm here to tell you that this is the end." A flicker of something, anger, fear, crossed his face. He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him a chance. "You fired me without understanding what I did. You replaced me with a contractor you didn't vet. You called me a social climber. You told everyone you didn't need me." I leaned forward slightly, voice still low and controlled. "You were wrong." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, Margaret, I'm the reason Gold Peak Tech pulled out," I said flatly. "I'm the reason Lawson & Reed is signing the clients you're losing." His mouth dropped open slightly, the color draining from his face. "You did this?" he breathed. "I didn't sabotage anything," I said coolly. I simply reminded our former partners what respect looks like. They made their own decisions. He sat there, stunned, trying to piece together the ruin around him. I gathered my folder, stood up. "I came back not to save you," I said, my voice like ice. "I came back to make sure you saw who dismantled your little empire." He rose shakily to his feet, hands trembling slightly. "You'll regret this," he said, voice hoarse. I smiled, a real smile this time, one touched with genuine satisfaction. "No," I said. "You will." Without another word, I walked out. I didn't look back. Not at the office, not at Christopher, not at the broken shell of a company collapsing behind me. Some endings don't need grand finales. Sometimes it's enough to know you walked away while the fire you never started burned everything they thought they owned to ash.